Hi everyone, this is Tachyon on Chessable.com. This is the introduction to my repertoire for black. In this video, I'll give an explanation of each of the openings in this repertoire and show a variation from each of them to demonstrate what kind of structure we typically get. The repertoire covers 12 different openings in response to either c4, d4, e4, f4, or knight f3. I'll show each of them in a moment, and they can also be found on the repertoire's page. I've chosen the 12 responses since they offer good chances for black, and I've tried to steer the variations in a dynamic and interesting direction, instead of just playing for a draw. Without further ado, let's look at the openings. The first opening covered is the Danish Gambit, which comes about after e4, e5, and then d4. And here I'm advocating going down the main line. White has two pretty menacing bishops on this diagonal. However, black is up a lot of material, and if you just develop these two pieces like this, you can actually gain quite a big advantage after the precise queen f6. This is just one of the lines, but white will lose a piece and he's still down 3 pawns. So I think these lines offer good chances for black. Next up is the King's Gambit, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Comes after e4, e5, f4. And many famous games have been played in this opening, but what I'm advocating is somewhat of a sideline. d5, the Muzio counter gambit. And with this move, white is essentially forced to take, because if he plays e5, then we do play g5, and bishop c4 is not possible. So we're just up a pawn for nothing. So if he takes, knight f6, d4, we get back our pawn, and after something like this, he castles, and we castle the other way. This is one of the more peaceful lines, but of the 21 variations that are covered, many of them get pretty wild, as you can imagine from the King's Gambit. And I think this is quite pleasant for black, and there are good counter chances in many of the lines. Next is the 4 Knights game, which after e4, e5, bringing the 4 knights out, hence the name. There are a few options for white here, but one that's covered in the repertoire is this line, which I'm sure you're familiar with, many of you. I'm advocating queen d6 here, and after castles, bishop e6, d3, f6, and bishop e3, castles long. I think black has a small advantage here with the 2 bishops and a faster attack on the king side. This is just one of the lines, but 4 knights is not really a very ambitious try for white, and many times black is able to turn the tides. Next up is the Giuoco Piano, or the Italian game, as we call it in Europe. It comes about after knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and normally black plays bishop c5, but I'm advocating knight f6, which leads to some interesting positions. And here, what I'm primarily looking at is the fried liver attack with knight g5, where I'm advocating the very interesting Traxler counterattack with bishop c5. And this gets extremely wild, very, very fast. One sample line could be takes here, takes here. None of this is forced, but there's many, many, many lines in this complex. And usually something like this ends up being on the board. d5, you finally get back this piece. Have to block the rook. And it ends up looking something like this. And as you can see, black is down a whole piece for 2 pawns, but actually has a very strong attack on the king side. And if white were to play something inaccurate like d takes e4, then this is very unpleasant. g5, daring him to take on f7, which he shouldn't. Then queen g1, trying to trade the queens in a better endgame, but black is having none of it. And here you can take the rook. This is just one of the crazy positions that we get from this opening, and I think it offers black extremely good chances if white takes on f7 with the knight. However, if he does take with the bishop, obviously white is up a pawn, but we have a half-open f-file, we have more pieces out, and we can generate an attack on the king side for sure. White is a bit better in this opening after bishop takes, but I think there's compensation, and the lines should demonstrate that as well. Next up, we have the Ponziani defense. After e4, e5, knight 3, knight c6, and c3. White's trying to play d4 with support from the c3 pawn and make a big center. But here I found a very nice way to combat this, I think, with knight f6, d4, and knight takes e4. White is spending so many moves moving his pawns that we're getting our pieces into the game. And after d5, I'm actually advocating the Fraser defense, bishop c5. And yeah, we're losing a piece, but actually this is very annoying for white. One sample line could be bishop takes, very importantly, to take with the bishop first, to disrupt the interaction of the white pieces. King e2 on the move, and then very importantly to retreat to b6 immediately, clearing the way for the knight to go in and get the fork. But it was important to stop white from castling ever, so we can keep the attack going if necessary. White's best move is probably queen d5, hitting the pawn and the knight. Now we have to drop the knight in, and rook g1 is kind of forced to keep the rook and keep the material. Now we can castle as black, and white can win another piece if he wants to. But this is very dangerous for white, and in fact the very best he can get is draw here. I think there are 1 or 2 variations that I've found where he can draw. In every other line, black is just better and will mate white. d5 is coming, e4 could be coming. All of black's pieces are working well, and white is not developed. So I think this is a very interesting opening for black, and I hope you like it as much as I do. Next on the list is the Scotch game. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, white strikes in the center with d4. And after we take, he can play bishop c4, the Scotch gambit. This is covered in the repertoire, but the main line is something like this, where black is just piling on the d4 square, getting the last piece out, and then white covers d5 with his bishop, quite important to do so. And here I like the move e6. After both sides castle, and queen d2 to do some skewers over here on g5. We get out of that. Bishop goes for an unprotected pawn, and this is the position we end up with. And in fact, black has a lot of attacking chances here with 2 bishops pointing down at the king. a good knight here on c6, helping him with tactics. And in fact, black's position is so good that if white takes on c7, he immediately loses a piece. So I think this setup for black is quite good, and it gets away from the lines that white might know if he's playing the Scotch game. So I like this quite a lot. The next opening we'll cover is the Vienna game. After e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6. White has a few options here, but the main move is f4. And I advocate the immediate d5, opening the center. Generally, play will go down a line somewhat like this. Bishop e7. And now white will cement the center with d4. Castles. Bishop d3. And now we protect the knight with f5. En passant, e takes f6. And we take with the bishop. Now white will usually castle, and after knight c6, you'll often take here, like this. And now after we take on d4, white can play knight g5. And this can get somewhat tricky. And in fact, right here there's only a single move that equalizes for black. But it does so, and then some. I think the Vienna game is quite a sideline. It doesn't really offer white any particularly good winning chances, so I feel it is somewhat easier to combat than some of the other lines. And finally, we come to the last e4 line. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, it is of course the Ruy Lopez with bishop b5. And here I'm advocating the Berlin classical variation, and it's definitely not what you think of when you think Berlin, with a quick queen trade and boring positions. Knight f6, castles, and now bishop c5. This is the classical Berlin. And black has gotten his pieces out and has quite a pleasant position here. White has two main moves, but the better one is c3, trying to play d4, and after we castle, we can play bishop back to b6. Just to show a sample line of what can happen here. It can go like this, and if white plays queen d3, we will take that bishop pair. And now white can decide to liquidate everything and win a pawn. But as it turns out, it's a very, very bad idea for him, because the rook is hit and his queen side is not developed. And after he plays here, we can play the other rook over, and every single piece is working now, even though our structure is worse. And we're now down 2 pawns. We're actually doing very well here. And should white play something like knight f5, he loses immediately to rook e4. I think this opening offers black a lot of counterplay, especially if white doesn't know what's going on, so I like this quite a lot for black. And that brings us to the first of the openings, which doesn't start with 1 e4. So we will go back to the starting position and play f4. This is the bird's opening, and it's not very common, but it can be played. One of the lines white can play here is g3, and no matter what white does, I'm advocating to get this Greenfeld set up. And castle, castle. Typically they'll play d3, now we can play c5, and play will go probably something like this. And now, because we can play e5, the position should be quite equal, even a bit better for black probably. So this should be quite a pleasant opening. The next opening we'll look at is the ready opening. After knight f3 as the first move, I'm recommending a somewhat symmetrical setup from the beginning. If white plays c4, then c5, and we can break the symmetry with d5 here. Typically the knight lands here on d5 in many of the lines, and if he goes for the fianchetto, we will do the same. And this is kind of a typical ready setup, where black will play knight b4 to cover d3 and c2, and now knight e5, attack the queen, check, block, bishop g2, and you can bring the queen out. And black has pretty good squares for all of his pieces. Bishop will go to g7 in a moment, and white doesn't really have any advantage here. And in many lines of the ready opening, you're tricked into some d4 opening that you don't really know. And I've tried to get some interesting positions here for black, while still trying to stop white's counterplay that he has in many of the lines. So this should be a satisfactory defense to the ready opening. Next up is the English opening, which of course starts with 1 c4, and here I'm recommending g6, which is the great snake variation, and I'm recommending it because it typically leads to some Grunfeld type positions, which I like very much for black. So if white goes for e4 here, we have to play e5 and then d4, knight f6. This is a pretty common line in this setup with g6, and black has to be very precise here, but will get a pleasant position if he is. Typically queen d5 and now f5 already this early in the opening. Looks very dangerous, but it's actually quite good for black. And then after knight c3, we can play c6, chasing the queen back. Typically goes to d3, and now knight a5. And if white continues to develop, the two knights will be supporting each other on e4 and c5. And if he brings it back here, we'll trade and play the other knight into e4. And here we just get a lot of counterplay. If he interposes with the bishop, we have several tricks where the e5 pawn might be hanging. So queen d1 is typically the try, and then d5, e takes d6, and bishop e6. And black will take the pawn and play long castles, or he will play bishop g7 and long castle. And this is quite pleasant for black. And I think this leads to some pretty interesting variations with the Great Snake variation, and many of them look like the Grunfeld, which we'll look at next. The Grunfeld has many different lines and variations in this repertoire, but it of course starts with d4, knight f6, c4, and g6. And black's goal here is to fianchetto the bishop after playing d5 here. It gets into an open position with a fianchetto bishop, which is pretty good for black and offers him counter chances. So I thought I'd look at one specific example here. This is one of the ways that white can play. Bishop g7, there's a queen a4 line, and bishop g7 blocks. And now you can play like this, and castle. And white will continue development with bishop f4, and now c6, e4, queen f5, d4, queen back to d8, e5, and it looks like black is getting a bit cramped, but soon you'll see the point. Chasing the queen back to b3, and now after bishop e6, white can actually try to go for this trade of 3 minor pieces for a queen. But after queen c8, it actually turns out that black is a bit better, because usually 3 pieces are better than a queen, but black will play the knight to a6 and the queen to e6 if he can. And there's a lot of pressure on these isolated pawns over here, and black actually has quite good winning chances here. This is just one of the many lines in the Greenfeld, 98 to be precise, and I've constructed them in a way that gives black a lot of counter chances, sometimes sacrificing a pawn, or here sacrificing or giving 3 pieces for a queen. And with that, we have covered each of the 12 openings in this repertoire, with one variation each. I hope that you'll like them as much as I do, and that you'll leave some comments so that we can make this repertoire better together. This has been Tachyon on Chessable.com. Thanks.